I swear to you, this is a true story from my own life. The first time I opened that leather briefcase, the stench of betrayal hit me harder than the mold on the papers inside. Tucked beneath yellowing folders, I found the contracts, their signatures lined up like smug smiles, spelling out a betrayal that had quietly bled me for decades. Those contracts, hidden in plain sight, explained everything: why my savings vanished, why my business collapsed, why my so-called partners lived so comfortably. While I clawed at scraps, I was 55 years old, and I had just uncovered the hidden noose they had fastened around my neck. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I should back up. For most of my adult life, I believed in loyalty. I believed in partnerships, in handshakes, in words that supposedly meant something. I built a small construction company out of Cincinnati, Ohio. We weren't flashy. We built homes, renovated offices, poured sweat into sidewalks and small-town projects. I started it in the early 1990s, fresh out of a string of miserable jobs, and by 2001, we were a respectable name in Hamilton County. My two partners, Dan and Cliff, were men I thought I could trust. Dan with his big, easy laugh and endless charm. Cliff with his calculating, sharp mind and promises of watching the numbers. For years, I saw us as a trio of brothers. We split long nights over coffee in dingy diners, argued over tile samples, celebrated wins with cheap bourbon in half-finished kitchens. I thought they had my back. But looking back, the first signs were there. The times Dan insisted on handling the city inspectors alone. The way Cliff's spreadsheets were too complicated for me to see. They fed me just enough to keep me busy, keep me believing, and I was blind. It wasn't until that one project in Norwood, a 3-story apartment renovation in 2015, that the first crack became a fracture. I had negotiated a deal with the client myself, a good deal, one that should have netted us a solid $180,000 profit. We worked through the winter, huddled in our coats as the Cincinnati wind cut through half-framed walls. By spring, the job was done. The client was satisfied, and I was ready to see the fruits of our sweat. That's when Cliff handed me a thin envelope. My cut inside was a check for $22,000. I stared at it like it was a joke. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice catching in the dust-filled trailer we used as an office. Cliff, without even looking up, said expenses were higher than expected. Permits, penalties, subcontractors. That's what's left. Dan clapped me on the back and grinned. "Hey, it's still something. We'll do better on the next one." I knew in my gut something was off, but I let it go. Because these were my brothers, right? And you don't accuse your brothers of robbing you blind. That night, I went home, poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, and stared at that check, $22,000, after months of back-breaking work. Wife Linda asked if everything was okay. I lied. I told her it was just a tough project. But in my gut, I knew they were bleeding me. I just didn't know how bad it was, or how deep the rot went, until I found those contracts. And once I did, I knew they would regret underestimating me. I remember waking up the next morning after that pitiful check, staring at the ceiling in my modest ranch-style home on the west side of Cincinnati. The hum of the old furnace filled the silence, but inside me, something restless stirred. I kept thinking about Cliff's, shrugged Dan's grin, that envelope. It wasn't just about the money. It was about being dismissed, handled like a child who couldn't understand the grown-up's business. Over the next weeks, my eyes sharpened. Things I'd overlooked for years suddenly screamed at me. Cliff never shared the books. Dan always had excuses for handling permits, licenses, and city fees without me. Vendors I thought we'd been paying, directly always dealt with Dan instead. When I'd ask about invoices, Dan would flash that easy smile, say, "Don't worry about it, bud, we got it handled." Handled, that word started to feel like a noose tightening. Linda noticed the tension before anyone else. My wife had been with me since we were 20. She knew my silences better than anyone. One night at our kitchen table with 2 empty plates pushed aside, she leaned across and said, "You've been chewing your tongue for weeks. Spit it out." So I did. I told her about the check, about my doubts about the way Dan and Cliff seemed to be running everything through smoke and mirrors. She listened, nodding slowly, her brown eyes sharp and steady. "Then find out," she said. "Stop trusting their word. You've built half this city with your hands. Build yourself some answers." Her words lit a fuse. The first place I started was with subcontractors. Over the years, we'd worked with dozens: plumbers, electricians, roofers. I drove around Cincinnati, knocking on doors, shaking hands. I asked questions that made me feel like a detective in a cheap movie. And little by little, a pattern emerged. On the Norwood project, a roofer told me he'd been paid in cash by Dan directly. A plumber said Cliff handled his check not from the company account, but from what looked like a personal one. When I asked for receipts, some shrugged. Others looked uncomfortable. It was clear money was flowing through channels I never saw. I remember one night sitting in the bar at Arnold's Downtown Papers, spread out in front of me. Old invoices, napkin notes. Anything I'd gathered. The place smelled of fried food and spilled beer laughter, echoing from the courtyard. But all I saw were numbers that didn't add up, checks that had been altered, signatures that looked off. That's when the paranoia really set in. How long had this been happening? Was it just one project, or every job we'd ever done? The more I dug, the more I realized how careful they'd been. They hadn't just skimmed profits. They'd rewritten contracts, hidden clauses, made sure I was always in the dark. They controlled the bank accounts, the bidding process, the negotiations. I had been nothing more than their workhorse, their front man, when they needed muscle or charm on a site. And the worst part, I had signed papers blindly trusting them. One evening, after weeks of restless nights, I went to the office trailer early before either of them showed up. Cliff was meticulous. He kept cabinets locked, files neatly arranged. But that morning, by some twist of luck or fate, he'd left a key in the drawer. I opened the filing cabinet and froze. Inside were contracts I'd never seen before. Contracts with clients. I remembered jobs I had sweated over. But the terms, they were different. My name was always there, my signature scrawled at the bottom. But the splits, the expenses, the fine print, it was all twisted to drain my share. One contract in particular nearly knocked the breath out of me. It was for a government project, a sidewalk repair job in Clifton. The original payout had been $240,000. According to the contract in my hands, after fees and penalties, I was entitled to less than 15%. For months of work for a project where I had personally overseen crews, in the blazing July sun, I sat there, my hands trembling, staring at my own signature. But I hadn't signed this. I knew my handwriting, and this was an imitation, a good one, but not mine. That was the moment the truth hit me like a hammer to the skull. They had been forging my signature. I shoved the papers back, locked everything as he'd found it, and drove home in a haze. My chest was tight, my palms slick. When I walked in the door, Linda took one look at me and said, "What did you find?" I told her, every word. Her face went pale, then hard. She poured me a whiskey, sat down and said, "Then you've got them. But you need to be smart. Don't tip your hand." Not yet. She was right. I spent the next months quietly collecting proof, photocopying contracts when I could, snapping pictures with my phone, tracking down subcontractors and clients. I even hired a handwriting expert, an old buddy of Linda's cousin, who confirmed what I already knew. Those signatures weren't mine. Meanwhile, Dan and Cliff carried on as if nothing had changed. They still laughed at their own jokes, still slapped me on the back, still treated me like a fool. Their arrogance was almost unbearable. I learned quickly that they thought they were untouchable. They had money connections, lawyers on retainer. They thought I was too old, too tired, too loyal to fight back. But what they didn't realize was that betrayal sharpens a man. At 55, I had nothing left to lose but my dignity, and I intended to reclaim it. I'll never forget the day the real turning point came. It was a sweltering August afternoon, and we were sitting in a half-finished office building in Hyde Park. The three of us were supposed to be discussing schedules. Instead, Cliff leaned back in his chair, smirking, and said, "Ab, maybe you should just focus on managing crews from now on. Leave the paperwork to us. It's not really your strong suit." Dan laughed loud and grating. In that moment, the humiliation burned hotter than the summer heat. They thought I was weak. They thought they had stripped me of power. But I sat there nodding, slowly, hiding my fury behind a mask of tired agreement. Inside, though I made a vow, I was done being their workhorse, done being their fool. It was time to burn everything they'd built on my back. The night I whispered that vow to myself, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, staring out the window at the quiet Cincinnati streets, the glow of distant headlights passing. My hands were steady for the first time in months, because now I knew revenge wasn't just a fantasy anymore. It was a plan. And once I started down that road, there would be no turning back. The plan began as a whisper in the back of my skull and grew teeth overnight. I knew I couldn't just storm into a diner and yell, "You stole from me." These were men with lawyers and bulldog egos. They ate accusations like I offered marshmallows. If I wanted to bring them down, I needed a scaffold of proof so heavy their best counsel couldn't shrug it off as sour grapes. I needed more than suspicions. I needed an avalanche. First, I fortified myself. I opened a new bank account owned in my name alone at a small credit union on Vine Street, away from the accounts Dan and Cliff oversaw. I quietly transferred what little savings I could spare. From old accounts, I started keeping every receipt, every scrap of paper, every text exchange. I bought a digital voice recorder and learned how to set it so it would automatically roll. I bought a secure external hard drive and a second phone, strictly for calls with witnesses and contacts. Everything had to be clean, traceable, and locked-tight. Next came the people. I've always believed that the people who've been walked on know where the bodies are buried. Subcontractors speak when they're asked properly, and when they know you'll protect them. I began to call slowly, methodically. The electricians who'd worked with us in Northside, the tilers from Oakley, the drywall guys who banged our walls in Over the Rhine. At first, I got the usual guarded answers. "We don't want trouble. We done got paid. We don't go poking into business." But I kept at it, and when I mentioned the Norwood check, the forged signatures, the roofer who said he'd been paid in cash by Dan, eyes went soft and jaws loosened. One by one, I started collecting sworn statements. Not the fanciful kind you see in movies, but short, clear notes, dates, amounts, who paid whom, who was present. I typed them up, email copies to myself from the burner phone, saved them in multiple places. When someone feared retaliation, I'd meet them at a diner. Café de la Musique in Hyde Park became a safe spot, or I'd pick them up and drive them to a park where we could talk without windows or cameras intruding. I bought them coffee, paid a few unsettled bills anonymously, and in return, they gave me names and details that started to stitch together like map points on a conspiracy. The more I held, the more brazen their methods looked. They had a system. Create 2 sets of books, one for show, one for siphoning. Small jobs were used to launder profits into personal accounts. Large government contracts were loaded with phantom penalties or grossly inflated subcontractor fees, which then needed to be paid out of the company's operating account and never showed up on any tax forms that reached my hands. When I asked questions, I was told I was not cutting it. When I demanded access, they smirked and gave me a line about fiduciary trust. It wasn't just the forged signatures. It was a web of shell companies. One morning, after weeks of late-night digging on my laptop, I found a name that kept popping up on invoices: Ashby Consulting. It wasn't a firm I recognized. When I ran a business registration lookup through the Ohio Secretary of State's site, ID learned how to do that quietly. The address led to a mailbox service in Sharonville. The phone number, when traced, went to Dan's cell. Ashby Consulting was a front. I printed the records and took them to a friend of mine, Ellie, who ran a small accounting firm near Findlay Market. Ellie was sharp and no-nonsense, the kind of woman who could find a missing penny in a pile of silt. I slid the folders in front of her in her office and watched her eyes flick across the numbers. "These are cooked," she said after 30 minutes of flipping, and whoever did this knew what they were doing. But they were sloppy too. They reused language, same markups, same dummy invoices. A good forensic accountant can trace the cash flows. "Can you?" I asked. Ellie nodded. "For the right fee, I can build a trail no lawyer will ignore." I didn't have the right fee. I had pride and anger, but sometimes pride pays the price. Sometimes you have to use the last of your dignity to buy justice. I wrote Ellie a check that made me wince and told her to start the audit. Ellie worked quietly. She spent nights combing payrolls, bank statements, ACH transfers, and tax forms. She called in a favor with a contact at Fifth Third Bank who would run transaction traces for an external audit. She cross-referenced dates and deposits. Within a month, she handed me a packet that read like a confession: payment streams from company accounts into personal accounts, reimbursements that matched vacation trips. Dan had taken checks billed to subcontractors that had different payees in the memo line, little breadcrumbs that proved deliberate misdirection. Armed with that, I did the one thing they wouldn't expect. I started using their bravado against them. I began to play a game they'd been playing with me for years: appearance. I acted as if nothing had changed. I laughed with them at the trailer, clapped them on the shoulder, let them think I was slow and ultimately harmless. But in private, I started planting seeds. First came the trap with the client from Clifton. I drove to the city municipal building and pulled the public contract records, physically cross-referencing them with the contracts I found in Cliff's filing cabinet. I discovered discrepancies between the contract terms filed with the city and the ones in their private files, amendments made after the fact, fees relabeled as penalties. With Ellie's audit in my pocket and the city's public records in my briefcase, I scheduled a meeting at the Hamilton County Courthouse. I told Dan and Cliff it was a simple matter of discussing an upcoming buy-down attempt to seem collaborative. They expected a charming, docile Ab. What they got was a man flanked by an accountant and an attorney. I'd hired on a whim Tom Reyes, a grizzled litigator from Cincinnati, who smelled like old books and wore suits like armor. I hadn't told them about Tom. I hadn't told them about Ellie. That element of surprise was a blade. We met in a small conference room above the courthouse, the city's stone facade visible through the window. The weight of the place made them uncomfortable. Their jokes faltered. I opened the folder, slid the prints across the table, and watched their faces change. Cliff's jaw tightened. Dan's hand went to his phone. "Ab, what is this?" Dan said, smiling thinly. "This is what you called my not cutting it," I said, voice low. "This is Ashby Consulting, all the phantom invoices and the bank traces that show where the money went. Ellie has matched payments routed through accounts that lead to you." "Tom here has some questions." Cliff's voice was smooth. "This is hearsay. You can't just—" Tom cut him off before Cliff could convince himself. "We're not here to argue in hypotheticals. We have record signatures that independent analysis shows do not match Mr. Ab's autograph. We have clients willing to testify they were paid in cash. We have a bank trace showing transfers to accounts registered under Dan Mitchell and Clifford Haynes. You want to make a scene, go ahead, but there will be subpoenas." For a moment I saw panic flicker across Dan's face, like a flame caught by a breeze. You could see their tightropes, their panic, their scramble. They tried to bully, to charm, to gaslight, but with the records and witnesses assembled, their theater fell flat. After that meeting, they lashed out. They tried to discredit Ellie, whispered that my documents were doctored. They sent me a terse email, threatening a defamation suit heavy with legalese. They started showing up more often at the trailer, leaving their cars idling longer, calling me Ab in public with forced warmth. They sent messages to some subcontractors trying to buy their loyalty back with small cash bribes. It was amateurish and ugly. I didn't flinch. If anything, the threats made them more reckless. They made mistakes. They paid a roof worker in cash and bragged to a buddy at a bar about how easily they'd rerouted a $40,000 invoice. A bar patron overheard and texted me. A subcontractor who'd been paid in cash suddenly turned on them when the money dried up, and he agreed to meet me at a bank to sign a statement. Still, I needed a legal anchor. Tom advised me to file a civil suit first, an injunctive action to freeze assets while we pursued damages. It would force discovery. It would bring their books under a judge's eye. It would also make them show their hand. Filing would be loud, public, exactly what I needed to cut off their maneuvering room. On a crisp November morning, I sat in the county filings office while Tom filled out the paperwork. My hands shook as he slid the filings across the counter, and the clerk stamped them with a red mark. The case number felt like a detonator. Word traveled through our little corner of construction in Cincinnati like a wind. Suddenly, people who had been afraid began to speak. A clerk at the city building in Clifton remembered seeing altered amendments. A supplier in Blue Ash found old checks that didn't align with invoices. Each new paper bolted another rung in the ladder I was climbing. They responded with fury. Dan filed a countersuit, an aggressive move, alleging I was embezzling company funds. He painted it as a smear campaign. Cliff posted an op-ed in a local trade newsletter about protecting small businesses from internal strife. They hired a high-priced PR firm and attempted to rally sympathy among vendors, whispering that I was the unstable partner, the unreliable foreman, but they'd already started to trip in public. A subpoena came through for Ashby Consulting's accounts. The mailbox in Sharonville yielded nothing more than receipts for UPS packages and a forwarding address. At a deposition, I sat across from Dan as he sweated through questions about a $12,000 transfer dated July 2016. He tried to pin his story on a bad memory, on accounting errors. The court reporter's keys clacked like a metronome recording every falter. The real turning point came when the county prosecutor's office called. Tom Thayer picky. There too much noise gets ignored, but Ellie's forensic audit had moved money in a way that suggested criminal intent. Forged signatures, systematic misdirection, and taxes not correctly reported for personal payments. The prosecutor asked for the packet. She wanted to meet. I spent the night before the meeting, cleaning my house like someone expecting company from a judge. Linda kept her distance. She said little, but when she pressed my hand, I felt her faith, like warmth. The prosecutor's office in downtown Cincinnati smelled of old coffee and granite. The assistant prosecutor who took the file had eyes that didn't betray emotion, and she read the audit as if it were a ledger of sins. "We can pursue this," she said finally. "But we need one more thing. Confessions or a trail that doesn't stop at shell companies. We need to connect the shell directly to Dan and Cliff, beyond reasonable doubt." That night, I lay awake and watched the city breathe. The case was moving towards something that could ruin them, in ways I hadn't even dared to imagine when I first found the contracts. It also put a target on my back. I had stepped into a war with men who would not stop at bruises. I thought of the fake signatures, of the way they laughed in the trailer, of Dan's easy charm that hid a hawk's calculation. I imagined them sitting at their kitchen tables, waking up in a panic, whispering about lawyers and reputations. But I also imagined my wife's face when the truth came out, the way her jaw had clenched that night. I'd told her I imagined the subcontractors who'd been stiffed finally getting paid, and the thought made my chest ache. The next morning, I put on a work shirt, slid into my truck, and drove to the Norwood site. Like any other foreman, I walked past scaffolding and insulation bundles, as if I belonged there. But my mind was elsewhere, on bank ledgers, on tax trails, on the thin thread that would tie Ashby Consulting to Dan's offshore account. I had one lead left, to chase a transfer from Ashby to a construction supply vendor that, if traced far enough, would reach back to Cliff's personal account. I called Ellie. She was already 3 steps ahead, sending over a printout with highlighted items. "There," she said. "Follow that chain. It will lead you to a mailbox company in Westchester, and then to a personal account with a bank in Kentucky. That account is linked to a vehicle registered to Dan. You've got them." A thrill ran through me, so sharp I had to sit down on a nearby stack of lumber. They were sloppy enough to leave a breadcrumb so big it would lead straight to them. I could taste the victory like copper. But victory in these things is rarely clean. I had one more move to make, and when I made it, they would either crack or go even darker. I drove to the mailbox in Westchester as the sky bruised purple, the last light glinting off the county buildings. The mailbox attendant was an older woman who watched me with tired eyes as I asked questions that sounded like small talk. She hesitated, then, after one more look around, slid a thin envelope across the counter. Inside was a receipt with an account number, and the account number, when matched with Ellie's data, pointed to a bank in Erlanger, Kentucky, and that finally pulled the thread directly to a vehicle registered to Dan Mitchell, a maroon Chevy with a dented bumper. My hands were steady as I snapped the photo. For the first time in months, I felt a fierce, cold joy. The endgame was visible now. All I had to do was tug. I walked back to the truck phone, buzzing with new emails. Depositions, scheduled subpoenas, served a message from the prosecutor, asking for me to be available. The city lights blinked awake. In the distance, the river traced a silver path through the night, and somewhere in his house, Dan would be answering the phone, his grip tightening as he realized the net was closing. I started the engine and breathed out, thinking about how this would end. Then the headlights of a blue sedan flashed behind me, and a man I'd never seen before stepped out, phone already pressed to his ear. He was smiling, but his eyes were small and hard. "Ab," he called, walking toward me with that confident stride of a man used to being untouchable. "We need to talk." The man's voice had a silky edge, the kind that tried to smooth over sharp steel underneath. I froze with my hand on the steering wheel, watching him close the distance. The parking lot was half empty. the glow from a liquor store sign, painting everything in neon red. My pulse hammered in my throat. He wasn't dressed like a thug. No leather jacket, no ski mask, just a pressed button-down and slacks, like he'd stepped out of some mid-level corporate office. But the way he carried himself told me exactly what he was, a fixer. The kind of man Dan and Cliff called when they couldn't buy someone's silence with bourbon and charm. I cracked my window just enough to let my voice slip through. "Don't know you," I said flatly. "You don't need to," he replied. "Name's Vince. I work with your partners." He leaned a little, eyes glinting. "You're making a mess. Lawyers, subpoenas, accountants. It's a lot of noise, and noise makes people nervous. They'd rather things stay quiet." There it was. The warning wrapped in civility, but a threat all the same. I stared at him for a long moment. The old method man who believed in brotherhood in handshakes might have backed down. But the man holding forged contracts, stolen profits, and a mountain of betrayal, he was past fear. "You tell Dan and Cliff," I said slowly, "that noise is all I've got left, and I'm not shutting up until they're ruined." His smile faltered. Just for a second, then it snapped back in place. He slipped a card through the cracked window. "No name, just a number, in case you change your mind," he said, then stepped back and watched me drive away. The entire ride home, adrenaline kept me wired. Linda was waiting at the door when I pulled in her arms, crossed tight against the chill. I handed her the card. She read it once, then fed it into the shredder without a word. The sound of the blades chewing that number felt like a vow. The next morning I doubled down. If they were sending men to intimidate me, that meant I was closer than they wanted me to be. I spent hours at Ellie's office, tracing the Kentucky bank account. Each transaction was like a puzzle piece, snapping into place. Withdrawals that lined up with Dan's vacations, payments that matched the down payment on Cliff's brand new BMW. Ellie leaned back in her chair, a grin tugging at her lips. "They've hung themselves. All we need is to pull the rope," and then came the day of depositions. We gathered in a bland, fluorescent-lit conference room downtown. The court reporter sat at her little machine keys, clicking like gunfire. Tom sat beside me, calm as a storm front. Across the table, Dan and Cliff tried to project confidence, but sweat stained their collars. The first few questions were routine financial records, project timelines. Then Tom slid the Erlanger account records across the table. "Mr. Mitchell," he said evenly, "can you explain why funds from Ashby Consulting were transferred directly into this account registered to your vehicle?" Don's face drained of color. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Cliff tried to jump in, but Tom raised a hand. The question was for Mr. Mitchell. The silence stretched every second, an indictment. Finally, Dan muttered, "I don't recall." Tom's eyebrows lifted. "You don't recall transferring $37,000. The court reporter didn't look up, but her fingers moved like lightning. Every stumble, every half-truth was immortalized. By the end of the session, they looked like cornered animals, and I, after months of humiliation, finally felt the balance shift. But revenge isn't a single blow. It's a campaign. The prosecutor moved forward with charges: fraud, forgery, tax evasion. The civil suit forced open their accounts. Subcontractors who'd once been silent lined up to testify. Their so-called PR firm went quiet once reporters smelled blood. Suddenly, Dan and Cliff weren't the slick businessmen of Cincinnati construction. They were crooks. I remember walking into Arnold's again. Same bar where I'd once sat, drowning in confusion. This time people nodded at me. A roofer bought me a drink. A tiler clapped me on the back. The whispers weren't about my failure anymore. They were about Dan and Cliff's downfall. The night the indictments hit the news, I sat on my porch with Linda, a bourbon in hand. The city buzzed in the distance, headlights streaking by like comets. "They're finished," she said softly. "Not yet," I replied. But soon, and soon came faster than I expected. Within weeks, Cliff's BMW was repossessed. Dan's house in Hyde Park went up for sale, foreclosure looming. Their names became poison in the industry. No subcontractor wanted to touch them. No bank wanted to lend to them. And when the prosecutor's office announced formal charges, they weren't just ruined financially. They were branded criminals. But the sweetest moment came in the courthouse. Months later, when I took the stand, I told the jury about the contracts, the forged signatures, the years of betrayal. I showed them the briefcase, the yellowing papers, the signatures that weren't mine. I watched the jurors' faces harden, their eyes narrow, and when the verdict came back, guilty on multiple counts, I felt something inside me unclench. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even relief. It was colder than that. A steady, quiet vindication. Afterward, people asked me if I was glad, if I felt triumphant. The truth, I felt haunted, because every brick we laid together, every laugh we shared, every night, we sat in diners dreaming about building something. Reality had all been poisoned, and revenge, no matter how satisfying, doesn't wash that poison away. On the night of their sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps, the city lights glowing around me. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. I ignored them all. I just whispered to myself, "You should never have underestimated me." And I walked into the Cincinnati night free at last, but carrying a weight he'd never be rid of. The end.